Okay, welcome to our second week of, second week, that's true, second lecture of our second week. We're going to talk about defense strategies and just take a look at pornography and technology and the consequences of such. Again, Lindsay and I have typed out some notes for you so that you don't have to type everything out in hopes that it's helping. Yeah, we'll just jump in right away here. So we're obviously going to want to connect this to previous material. I think defense mechanisms, pain, and cognitive distortions are pretty straightforward, but I will definitely try to make that linkage of how that ties into the type of sex addict. You know, we talked about in last lecture about addiction stages. And when defense mechanisms start to become really apparent. We already know what some criterion are to recognize when addiction is present, so I won't be discussing that again because I've talked about it in every lecture thus far. We have talked a bit about some assessment pieces and definitely etiology of sex addiction and some of those negative consequences. I think this stuff definitely ties into how cognitive distortions are played out. How we challenge the client. Fear and shame are really huge components. And then we'll jump in and take a look at cyber sex porn and technology. I want to give everyone a heads up here. There's going to be a lot of swearing probably in this lecture. Some of the content may make you feel uncomfortable, but I will discuss when I get to that last video. They have updated the video, except if I were to show it, it would probably be hardcore pornography. Which, you know, I don't think I need to show you guys that. I'm not sure the benefit in that, but I do think that the last video that I do show will it does create a sense of conversation and tends to be quite interesting in terms of how this may play out for people with addictive processes, or even, you know, some of us or all of us who are on a continuum of figuring out what healthy sexuality, relationships, and you know, I guess what that means for us. You know, as clinicians, we often have to break through a lot of defense mechanisms. You know, the quote here by Courtwright is a developmental perspective, which aligns with Gabor Mate, Kadiakis, Dan Siegel, Russell Brand. I can't remember if I put that clip in here or not, but we'll talk about him in a bit anyway. We can bring him in later if I didn't post that for you. But this quote really stuck out to me in grad school, and I don't have the page number on there. That is not okay. I'll have to fix that. I think it's page 46. So my graduate work. But this quote really sticks out for me, that the reason that most clients enter therapy is because they are stuck, not developing as fully as they sense they could. The reason they are stuck is because they are not operating with full consciousness. There are blind spots or phobic avoidances or defenses which prevent the awareness of essential feelings or aspects of themselves. You know, and as I talked about from Gary in my article, right, that addiction is a coping strategy for existence. Ogden, Minton, and Payne, from a trauma perspective, talk about people developing character strategies, or EPs, emotional personalities, as a way to keep them alive. I think that all of this plays out in the etiology of every domain, right? Whether it's attachment, trauma, religion, opportunity. You know, essentially this is a contraction of consciousness, right? Which is all types of sex addiction and love addiction. All right, so the most commonly known defense mechanism is denial. So you probably want to just put a little star beside that. That's important for you to know. Defense mechanisms are unconscious and automatic. All right, so just remember what Dan Siegel talked about in terms of presence. Right, when we're in our defense strategies or mechanisms, we're not in open consciousness, you know, we're not in full presence. We're often probably getting reminded of our faulty core drivers, our wounds, maybe some of our belief systems, and how reality is sort of running up against that. In order to deal with pain, You know, there's this strategy for survival. So Almas talks about this in Holes in Being. Alex Katiakis talks about this in terms of dark emotions. Brene Brown talks about shame. You know, and I also discussed narcissism as a way to, you know, just understand sort of the development of this stuff. Now again, if you're taking a look at your notes, you know, Carnes talks about that these defense mechanisms protect us from, you know, a sense of pain that people are feeling. It's really paradoxical that these defense mechanisms, you know, are a way to sort of protect individuals from their pain, but these are also the defenses and obstacles that stand in the way of recovery. And it takes a lot of skill and awareness as a clinician to also not get activated by this stuff. And in one of our last lectures, we'll talk about countertransference, because as you can imagine, we get activated as human beings by other human beings and their strategies if it reminds us of our own developmental and trauma, right? So that's an interesting conversation that we'll have later. But let's talk about what some of this stuff looks like. So again, most common is denial. Pretty straightforward. I think we know what that is, right? It's the kind of thinking and reasoning used to avoid the reality of behavior or consequences of the behavior, right? It's a way to manage the chaos and out of control. And it also protects addicts who believe that their sexual behavior they can't live without. You know, it's not uncommon, and I'm sure later I'll talk about it, it's not uncommon to have sex addicts come into my practice and they'll say, without sex, I'm going to die. One, that's not true. I think, you know, if anyone's listening to this lecture, you may have a bit of a grin or kind of have a bit of a chuckle because that's so far gone. But they do believe that. Especially if they have had, if they're in their depths of their cycle and believe that this is the reality, and it's their reality, right? Not in reality. So when we take a look at rationalization, they may justify their unacceptable behavior. You know, they may say things like, I'm not the one who has a problem. You know, my wife is just a prude, or I'm sexually liberated. You know, which is what I just got a new client this past week, and she had said, you know, Marie, I'm just sexually liberated. Like, I don't have an issue. And I had said, well, you know, okay, that's cool. I'm into sexual liberation of all individuals, but I just wonder how having 14 relationships, being married, having 3 abortions in the last year, waiting for test results of HIV, and possibly having to make quite a few calls if other people have contracted it. I'm just not sure how that relates to sexual liberation, to be sexually liberated. You know, could you tell me about that? And after 2 hours, folks, I mean, she started to think about it's a possibility that she may not be sexually liberated, that there could be problems. So some of this stuff is pretty ingrained. Minimizing, right? So trying to make behavior consequences seem smaller or less important than they are. Oh, you know, I only engage in chronic masturbation and pornography 3 days a week. It's really not as much as my wife thinks it is. Comparison. You know, I hear this all the time, that they'll always shift focus onto someone else and justify their behaviors. Well, I'm not as bad as that so-and-so in my SA group. You know, they're visiting massage parlors and seeing prostitutes, whereas me, I'm only looking at pornography 8 hours a day. It's not nearly as bad. Uniqueness, right, and this is huge. Every sex addict and love addict who I've worked with, not necessarily love addicts, but can have a flavor of this, but sex addicts for sure, they always think that they are different or special, right? But my situation is different, my issues are different, I'm unique, people don't get me because I'm just so special in this way. You know, that might be fine for everyone else, but I've just got far too much going on in my life for me to be able to attend therapy regularly or group therapy. People can blame. You know, I have to use pornography because every time my baby cries, it just makes me feel really nervous and anxious, and therefore it's because of my newborn that I'm relapsing. Which on some levels is probably true. May not have enough stress coping strategies, or it could be activating developmental trauma. But I really don't know if it's a newborn's fault that someone is relapsing with pornography use. I say this facetiously, obviously. Global thinking, right? So attempting to justify why something is not a problem and using terms like always, never, and no problems, right? So very, also kind of falls into black and white thinking. They may avoid by creating a distraction, right? I've seen a lot of seductive role sex addicts use humor, or I've seen a lot of other sex addicts be really angry and use rage to frighten or push people away. They may threaten or posture. Sometimes they may use shocking behavior as a way to be sexual. I often share with people I come from an Italian background, so if anyone has ever met an Italian family or even people from European families, some of them, they're very emotive and excited when speaking. And I think that honestly is a gift, because there is a lot of individuals who come into my office that may go into rage and anger, and it just does not set my system off. And it's very interesting to watch how people respond to it, because you may not be giving the reaction that they're hoping for. They're not able to sort of push you away with that. Avoiding by omission. This is so tough for addicts, and I'm just thinking right now, this is one of the last things when people are in recovery to sort of move through. I had a guy in my practice last week, and I have a grin on my face because he came in and he was like, I am lying and omitting about the dumbest stuff, Marie, and I don't know why. We processed it, and we'll talk more about that towards the end of it, but a way to omit is to manipulate, the conversation to avoid talking about something, or they'll leave out important bits of information, especially when we're doing disclosure, which we'll talk about with partners. This is a piece that is really important in terms of what information to include. Intellectualizing, right? So avoid feelings and responsibility by thinking or by asking why. So they can explain everything. So there's a guy that I work with, we often talk about taking laps around the lake. And this guy, he uses words that I have never heard before. I don't even think I could spell. He's incredibly intelligent. And so we talk about his word wall and sort of how using his word wall is a way to sort of deny and sort of get lost in storytelling, and to use his intelligence as a weapon so that we don't have to talk about certain things. And I personally don't have any problem saying I've never heard that word before. Like, what's happening right now? Why are we using such big words? And I've been working with him for a couple of years, and it's been interesting now that he starts to catch himself taking a lap. Hopelessness, right? So there's this underbelly narcissism to it. I'm the worst. I'm a victim. I can't help it. So they go really passive around this stuff as a way to sort of not deal. Manipulative is usually involving some distortion of reality, including the use of power and lies, secrets, or guilt to exploit one another or others. Compartmentalizing, right? Separating your life into compartments in which you do things that keep separate from other parts of your life, right? This seems pretty straightforward for addiction. And crazy making, right? So when confronted by others, you share your perception, telling them that they are totally wrong. Action is indignant towards them, and it's an attempt to make them feel crazy by telling them in a sense that they cannot trust their own perceptions. So this is known as gaslighting, and we'll talk more about this in working with partners. So dissociation and sex addiction is this is a model that I work from that makes a lot of sense to me. So again, here's that cartoon of window of tolerance. This is what I often give clients. Pause the video right now, and I'd like you to watch the video of Kevin Spacey, kind of ironic considering he's in treatment right now for sex addiction and also sex offending. But I want you to watch this clip on American Beauty. So pause me right now. And then when you come back, we'll talk about it. Okay, so I'm assuming you watched the clip with Kevin Spacey. I think that this is a really clear depiction. So this is from the movie American Beauty. And this is where he, I don't know if you saw it, it's just like he totally goes into this altered state of reality, and obviously what's happening in front of him is not happening. And it's a way to sort of dissociate. And so I want to point out here, okay, when we look at this cartoon depiction of window intolerance, right? So revisiting. Being in our window means we're in flow, we're calm, you know, we're able to regulate, we can speak about our experience. And, you know, dysregulation, you know, means we can be anxious and revved up or angry, or we can be sad or feel like we're shutting down. But we haven't gone into dissociation yet. Dissociation means when we're going into the red, right? This is where we start to feel out of control and in extremes. This is where we might feel totally zoned out and numb. If you've ever seen the movie American Beauty, I think that he depicts this quite well. But I think that this is an important piece when we're talking about pornography, especially, and sex addiction. Alex talks about the neurobiology of this, and some of the, like, I think there's about 7 pages of it in there. For those of you who have a neuroscience or psych background, that might be really interesting for you, and I think it is interesting, but we won't be focusing on that piece because I think that that's a bit out of the scope for this course, if that makes sense. When I start to look at and think about dissociation, I think Erica Garza talks about it in her interview with Megyn Kelly about shame and how she dissociated and coped. But I want you to pause this slide, and I want you to click on the link for masculinity. And this is a quick clip that's about 3 minutes long, I think. And I just want you to notice what comes up for you when watching this, and then just return back to the lecture. I really have quite a somatic reaction when I watch that. And I think that when we start looking at gender considerations around masculinity and femininity, which we'll dive more into in a few weeks, we can understand why people dissociate from how they feel, or especially men and little boys. I've seen it in little boys especially, where they sort of become hard because they're not allowed to feel. I have a story to tell, but it's really personal, and I don't know that my nephew would be okay with it being on the internet, so I'll just sort of leave it at that. But a lot of men, when I show that, they tend to relate. And I think also when I get you guys to reflect on some of your own gender biases, this stuff contributes and ties into it pretty unconsciously, because we're pretty conditioned around some of this stuff. And I think this is a perfect place to sort of segue into shame, because again, as I said, I have a really somatic, deep somatic response when I see that video. So I'm going to hope that you watched Brene Brown's clips on shame and vulnerability. I show them in my men's group quite frequently. Right, so she talks about how, I think Alex talks about this in her book as well, about how shame is dis-ease that's passed through generations and intergenerational trauma and lack of communication, right? And I think a lot of us sort of talk about this in terms of our own sexual education experience, and why people look at our culture of inability to talk about what healthy sexuality is and relationships. You know, we know that physiologically people with shame, even though there is, you know, various cultural practices and beliefs, common somatic holdings of shame is that people have a lowered head, their social engagement system is turned off, meaning they have a hard time maintaining eye contact, and they may have a red face. Social shaming, you know, is employed to ensure expected behavior. You know, we see a lot of this in our day-to-day lives. I think that gender is a huge component of this, and I'll be curious to hear what others think of this. You know, Brene Brown talks a lot about the difference between guilt and shame. And I think that, you know, one of the other components that we have to think about when it comes to shame is that we all sort of experience shame, like healthy shame, and then there's unhealthy shame. So unhealthy shame is like chronic shame, you know, that can happen in relationships at home through a culture. And we all ought to have healthy shame, because healthy shame is what neurobiologically and evolutionarily keeps us sort of moving forward and not doing things in such high risk. But if you remember the cycle of sex addiction, the core component of sex addiction and love addiction is shame, and which often drives people to keep doing some far gone behaviors as a way to not feel that. I often talk about, when I train clinicians, and even today when I was at the training that I was at, I often talk to people and students about shame, and you know, it never fails. I always have, you know, 2 or 3 people say, "Well, I don't feel shame. Shame doesn't bother me at all." And you know, what I say to people is the only people who don't have shame are psychopaths. That's why they're psychopathic. Their brains are, you know, even when we look at brain scans, their brains literally do not light up where for other human beings shame emits itself. So you have an option. I mean, it's cool if you feel totally open and liberated to share that you're a psychopath. But there could be this other piece that Brene Brown talks about is, you know, we, especially in North America, shame is an epidemic. Again, this ties into our developmental stuff, but we're really afraid to talk about it. And the thing is with shame, and anyone who's felt shame, the less that you talk about shame, the more power it has. You know, shame is this fear of disconnection. You know, we pretend like we don't have it. We pretend that it doesn't affect people. But it's this real big piece of struggling with vulnerability, right? And there's interesting myths around vulnerability in North America and other cultures as well. As I said, we have a really diverse class, so it'll be interesting to see cultural beliefs of vulnerability. I don't think that it's something that's easily come by. I mean, as I shared, I'm from an Italian family. And so it's, you know, it's weak to, quote unquote weak, I'm sorry, you guys can't see me doing quotations. It's weak to admit that there may be issues. It is considered, you know, problematic if you admit that you even have feelings. So, I mean, I own that I went through a lot of therapy in order to be comfortable in my own vulnerability and work through shame. And I think it's a human being issue, right? When we take a look at Western culture, we have all sorts of ways to shame ourselves, right? This can be through comparison or feeling unworthy or our faulty core drivers. You know, I love this cartoon, right? I tripped and fell into some feelings. I'm okay now. I brushed that shit off. Cracks me up every time. But there is this real sense of our core identity being, there's something wrong with us. There's something wrong with me. And there's different ways to defend ourselves against shame. So there's rage, and there's contempt, and there's perfection, and blaming, and withdrawal. But I'm hoping this sort of helps you understand why we may respond a certain way to people, and or why sex addicts or love addicts may so deeply believe some of these denial strategies that feel so far out there. So I thought it would be helpful just to sort of discuss some shame types, and I think Brene Brown does a really good job of that. But some of the shame categories that we all feel shame about, so it can be about our appearance and body image. I laugh about this because I think it's quite funny, but I had a student who really tried to shame me about my appearance and made comments about my wrinkles on my face. I have crow's feet. And decided to do this. I was teaching a class of 110 students, and he had decided to call me out on my wrinkles. And for those of you who have ever been taught by me before or know me, I don't tend to really back down by things like that. And I really just met him with sassiness, to be honest, and I just sort of let the whole class know, like, I've earned every wrinkle on my face. I'm proud of these. And most people laughed, but he did not know what to do, that by shaming me in front of 100 and some people, that I didn't sort of collapse and become passive. And so it was just, I just think of that because that was just as of recent. We shame people around money and work. That's an interesting one. We're talking about, actually, CBC just released a study about the amount of people that keep up with the Joneses, and that as of today, a lot of people may give off the impression that they have a lot of money, but are in serious debt as they're trying to sort of keep up with their neighbors, which is interesting. We shame mothers and fathers all the time. So anyone who has a family, or who is a mother, who's going to be a mother, or going to be a father, or any of that, we give advice, we tell them what they're doing is wrong. We shame them for whatever they're doing. So I often give people the example, like, if you ever walk through a Toys R Us, and you've got a kid that's screaming and a mother who just, like, doesn't know what to do with it. Most people have these thoughts of, like, get a hold of your kid. What kind of mother are you? All of these things. But for most people, they, when they've done some of their own work, it's like owning that we have some of these shaming thoughts of other people, right? Family systems, I already talked about that in terms of parenting. Mental health and physical health, we shame the shit out of people with that stuff. Addiction, for sure. Sex, we talk a lot about that. Slut shaming, that's a pretty basic example. Aging, right? I think we shame a lot of seniors, or maybe people like me at my mid-30s who have crow's feet. We shame people with religion, people who've survived trauma, and we often use labels to do so. So here are some examples of some of these shields. Right? Often we will talk about perfectionism. Have you ever met someone who demands perfectionism or strives for perfectionism? It's interesting, right? I think that a lot of us, and probably most of us in university, we do these things, obviously, and we want to, get a good grade, and we work really hard. But often, it's not, perfectionism isn't about striving for excellence or self-improvement. Succeeding or, or looking and doing things perfectly can avoid feeling judgment, blame, or shame. She talks a lot about it in her TED Talks around, what piece does she talk about? Motherhood and women. There's a lot of women with perfectionism issues, I think with men as well, but she focuses on this shield with women. Perfectionism is about trying to earn approval, right? So when I look at people's and work with people around, where does perfectionism come from? Why, especially when we talk about, this is really interesting. I don't know how I feel about this, but I'm just going to put this out here. There's a lot of studies that say that certain generations don't know how to fail. There's a lot of, and this creates a huge discussion, so I'm just putting it out here. It's not to offend people, but this idea that in schools, in elementary schools and high schools, that now there is no failing. Everyone passes regardless, or everyone gets a gold medal, or everyone gets first. And so sometimes there's this constant drive to earn approval. And so if you don't get gold or first, it means that there's something wrong with you, which is really interesting. You know, a lot of people may think things like, what do people think? Am I enough? You know, it's about looking and doing things perfectly. And depending on intersectional pieces, perfectionism is correlated with depression and anxiety and addiction. Missed opportunities is a big one. It's also tied in with like heart issues, cancer, and just trying to do it all, which Gabor Mate talks about, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Well, not a little bit, but in a few weeks. So shields against shame, right? So numbing. You know, we numb ourselves all the time. I think when we're online, we numb ourselves. Drinking, you know, marijuana, any types of substances, right? So anything that makes us feel less of something. So avoiding our feelings, right? Right. So there's just this desire to not be present. Right. And I want to get clear here. We all do this. We all need a break. And I mean, having Donald Trump as president, we all need a break. I know I'm trying to really limit my conversation about him. But I think there is a difference, and I often talk to clients about this, that there is a difference in numbing out or taking a break consciously versus unconsciously falling into habits to numb out because you can't cope, if that makes sense. There's shadow comforts. Again, I think the same thing as numbing. You know, we might spend endless hours online feeling like we're comforting ourselves, but really what we're doing is, you know, just casting shadows over our lives and avoiding. Some of these other ones, right? So Viking or victim, right? So this is black and white thinking. You know, Vikings may label themselves as success stories, you know, so it may be based on winning or survival, right? So about combat or trauma. But when that's removed, it's just merely surviving, right? So I often think of people, I think we'll talk about this here in a little bit too, but I often think about people who hide behind credentials, right? Not that I think that you need to not be proud, but there's a lot of like physicians and surgeons that I've worked with, and actually judges and lawyers, that sort of throw this, well, you know, I'm a judge, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, and I often put out there and I say, and so, you know, well, I've done this and I've done this and I've done this, and it's like, well, that's interesting, but we're trying to connect here. You know, especially around sex addicts, right? So I work with quite a few lawyers, right? So they will often go into this idea of how successful they are. And most people, and Pete Kellett talks about this actually in his courses, that he talks about people with PhDs having trauma histories and needing to succeed to have a way of having value in the world and being needed, which Dr. Mate talks about as well. Oh, actually, and that falls into cynicism, criticism, cool, and cruelty. I think some of this stuff sort of overlaps with one another. You know, I can talk to you because of A, B, and C, but I can blow you off because of who I am. Great clip from Louis C.K. on this stuff. And then there's joy biting. This is interesting. Joy is the most difficult feeling to feel for humans. Positive psychology actually shows, and I'm trying to remember of the psychologist and researcher who analyzed some infants' behavior and talked about how babies actually throw their toys on the floor because they're unable to stay with joy. That it's not actually about testing attachment. So interesting piece, I won't get into that, but different way of sort of looking at things. And Brene Brown talks about this, right? If we're in a culture of deep scarcity, which we are, right? We don't feel safe. We don't feel certain, and we sure don't feel enough all the time. We're going to be unable to hold space for uncertainty, risks, and emotional exposure. When we're always chasing for moments, which I think technology, Instagram, you know, Facebook, it's built a whole industry on this, right? I'd like you to pause And I have this clip of this little girl that I often show that I find to be very infectious. So just pause it, watch it, and then come back. You know what I say to people? Like, when was the last time you felt that much joy? I mean, children are just so infectious around some of those things, and just appreciate simple things in life, and just, I don't know. Anyway, I just often show that because I think as adults and sort of growing up, we sometimes lose a piece of innocence. We'll talk about the importance of play, actually, in recovery later on. This is one of your questions. And this is actually an essay that I often get people to write on. But, I mean, just something for you to reflect on if you want. Brene Brown talks about how shame is universal, and it's definitely intersectional, right? It can be around ethnicity, age, how much money you have, your education, you know, are you able-bodied, not able-bodied. It just keeps going and going. So if you remember that little cartoon I showed you from Shields, it's all contributes to it. But I think that I'm hoping that from that, those two TED Talks, that you know, some of the ways that people learn to navigate this epidemic of shame, and some of the belief systems that come from that, that it is universal, and maybe even just knowing that can sort of help decrease the amount of shame. The other piece that Alex Katiakis talks about is there's neurobiology of shame, right? And we talked about this in the previous lecture of unhealthy ways of medicating or coping. But there's a lot of neurobiology in shame, and seeking behaviors as well, and rage. So it just depends on sort of your attachment style, developmental trauma, and different components of that, and how you've learned to emotionally cope. Some of the ways that I think this shows up for men and women, say in sexuality, right? And Brene Brown talks about, you know, women having unattainable expectations of who they are and how they're supposed to be, and do it all perfectly. Whereas for men, maybe they're not supposed to be perceived as weak. Now we're going to be talking about fluid sexuality and gender orientation in a couple weeks. So I just want to be clear here that some of these boxes around sexual expression and sexual repression is definitely heteronormative, and shame is even more increased when we don't fall into these components, you know, in terms of masculinity and femininity. Right, so for females, they may feel sexually inferior, you know. For men, you know, erectile dysfunction can show up. You know, fear of inadequacy and shame is very common. You know, love equals sex for women, masculinity equals sex for men. This can result in trading sex behaviors or pornography, trauma bonds or trauma wounds, gender socialization, I mean, disorders of the body, whether it's eating disorders or body dysphoria, and hookup culture plays a huge role in this as well. This is, I cannot remember if I put one of these. Oh, I put one of these, I think, on your reflective paper, but I used to get students to write a 10-page paper on this, which is intense and a lot of work in terms of reflecting on your own stuff. It's just reflecting on, you know, how you coped with some of these issues around shame and sexuality, and or just shame in general. It doesn't have to be sexuality based by any means. This takes us into looking at what cybersex, pornography, and media and technology. This cracks me up because I tell people that I'm an expert in this area, and yet I can barely work Moodle and YouTube, so it's humorous. I can laugh at myself. But I get really excited to talk about these things because usually there's really interesting conversations around some of these components. Dr. Cooper talks about the 3 A's, big thing, right? So being online, it can be anonymous, it's available at any time, and it's accessible anywhere. Kimberly Young did a lot of work on this in the early 2000s around internet sex addiction and internet addiction, actually, and talked about the 3 A's. Robert Weiss talks about the old gap versus new gap, right? So we're talking about digital immigration versus digital natives. So for any of us who are 35 years and older, raise your hands. We are digital immigrants, right? So I was talking today, you know, I didn't grow up with cell phones. You know, in high school we had a phone, or I had a phone, that could hold 7 text messages. We had to use T3 with your thumb, if that makes sense. I'm sure some of you are laughing. And when I was in college, we had cell phones, but they didn't even have cameras on them. We didn't even have the internet to look up for articles and such, like, you know, when we're writing papers. So it's an interesting time in terms of digital natives. And we're going to talk about this in a bit. And I don't want to be prejudiced around this stuff because I try to be open to it. But sometimes, you know, people say, oh, you know, this younger generation is so much worse than us because of A, B, and C. And look at the technology and what's it doing. You know, Robert Weiss talks about that it's not necessarily right or wrong, it's just different, right? That online behavior is really changing younger people's ideas of sexuality, dating, and intimacy. He makes the argument, which I think is fair and interesting, that, you know, I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard, so digital natives, so anyone who's 35 years and younger, that, you know, you're not connecting, or there's something wrong with you, that you're always on your phone. And Robert Weiss, years ago, made the argument that actually, maybe the fact that we're looking at this wrong, what about the fact that maybe younger people are actually building communities and more interest in one another online through a relational and social experience, and maybe their ongoing immediate interconnectivity is actually helping relationships move in a positive direction. You know, the other thing that he talks about is how personal privacy is shifting, right? There's a lot of people who put a lot of stuff online that maybe they wouldn't share otherwise if they didn't grow up in this sort of environment of technology and sort of putting our lives out there. This is an interesting perspective, especially next week when we sort of look at teenagers and some of this stuff. But I just think it's a different perspective, and it's important to sort of put that out there or recognize what some of your biases are. This takes us to classic versus contemporary sex addicts. Now, I've talked about this, right? So the 3 C's for digital age conditioned sex addiction are culture, chronicity, and content. You know, this, as we're moving to look at, you know, porn addicts, you know, we're not looking at traditional sex addicts where they've got early life trauma, right? We're looking at a group of people who are obsessed with sexual fantasies and behavior online, and that, you know, they often don't have control over that behavior because they've attempted to try to stop and they've failed to quit. And as a result, they're experiencing negative consequences. And in this sense, to me, they and Dr. Weiss, they qualify as sex and porn addicts. But they may not have the trauma-driven need or desire to escape from their emotions like traditional trauma sex addicts. Often, digital-aged sex addicts start using at a really young age, which we'll talk about here in a bit, so it really becomes habitual. And often, if this is at a young age before puberty, they have a really hard time moving beyond it. So a lot of men and women who come in to see me who may fall under a contemporary sex addict, they are usually developmentally delayed, which often is tied into the age that they started using pornography. And so they may have a lot of immature perspectives on what relationship or what healthy sexuality is, right? And often lack in sexual education and sexual fulfillment. And they are unable to create meaningful attachments with others. I think that Robert Weiss gives a great case study example with Steve. I'm not sure that there's anything else that I can add to it. I think it's pretty straightforward, but I think that's a really good example of looking at what some of these issues may look like. I don't know if anyone has ever seen Family Guy. If you've ever seen Quagmire, have you noticed that his arm is really big? So Dr. Cooper talks about how internet sex is the crack cocaine of sexual compulsivity. And so for people who fall under traditional profiles, the internet really was like cocaine, right? And exploded in terms of the impacts and consequences from some of these sex addicts, right? So, for example, some of these individuals used to have to look in a newspaper for escorts. You don't have to do that anymore. You can do it from the privacy of your home. This cartoon cracks me up, right? So if anyone's seen this episode, Quagmire has been in his house jerking off for 3 days because he just discovered internet porn. Hence why one arm is bigger. So it's just a bit of a joke, but I often use this in my lectures. I'd like you to pause the lecture and watch this video on the science of pornography. I think it's a really great depiction of how pornography can become addictive for individuals. So I think they do a really good job of depicting how porn can become addictive. It ties right into Alex's book around dopamine and how it gets released with every orgasm and experience. Now, porn can be luring, right? So they say, this is from 2015, so the stats may be a bit different, but they say about a quarter of search engine requests are porn related. 35% of downloads are sexual imagery. A porn addict on average watches 11 hours of porn per week. This is often double or triple, to be honest. Dr. Weiss talks about things being, porn can be interactive, it can be safe and compact. Gary Wilson talks about how there is a lack of control group. So he actually has a website, nofap.com, and actually sex addict and porn addict individuals have created a website that's like nofapaddiction.com or something. It's like one extra word before or after. And they post all this research to try to disqualify all of the neuroscience. And again, we're not going too hardcore into the neuroscience in this course, but if you are interested, Dr. Donald Hilton is a Canadian neuroscientist. They try to refute that guy's research, and it's pretty heavy duty. So I'm not sure that you can. But the thing that's really interesting about Gary Wilson is that in order for us to do research, we are unable to find a control group to check out what people's brains look like before pornography versus after. The control group that people can use is recovering porn addicts, but we're unable to find a group of people who have not been exposed to pornography, and that's pretty interesting in terms of ethics and research. Taking a look at the lure of porn as well. So there's porn-induced erectile dysfunction and porn-induced delayed orgasm. I have a wonderful video for you guys to watch here in a little bit about that. But I hear these stories from students every time I've taught this course. I've heard about young women, and this is a heterosexual example, young women who may be having sex with their partners, and they have to get up and leave, find the computer, look at pornography, get hard again, and then go back to having sex. This is now being documented in women as well, and delayed orgasm, so unable to have an orgasm unless there is porn. In 2014, Global News posted a news story about young men using Viagra as a way to get an erection because of porn use. So we have men who are in their early 20s using Viagra, and so you can just imagine how that is impacting their system. And is really quite interesting, as Viagra is not meant for individuals in their quote-unquote prime. Now the cyber hex stuff, I have typed this out for you. Let me just see here. So cyber hex includes, 6 functions served by cyber sex, right? So again, the AAA engine, what we've talked about, but some of the psychological components of the addictive process of cyber sex includes that it's intoxicating, right? So we can feel euphoric. I think this is where dopamine and oxytocin, I think, can also be released if we start bringing in sex robots, which is a whole other discussion that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But there's a sense of a quick fix and instant gratification. It can be isolating, right? With this digital shift, people are able to experience this intoxication privately and quickly. Again, the most challenging area for addicts to work on, right? So I may have a lot of porn addicts who masturbate in public bathrooms. That's an example. It's integral, right? This is difficult because, you know, internet is part of our daily life. So if you know that you have an internet sex addiction, it can get kind of complex in terms of setting up boundaries and ways in which that we can navigate day-to-day life in the internet when our addiction is infused with that. It's inexpensive, so cost is pretty low for internet, but often, you know, we do want to take a look at, is there a relationship between money and sex? It can feel imposing as we need to use the internet to function, and interactive, right? So can feel more real versus other forms of media, so it fuels fantasy and it can tie into our arousal template, which we'll talk about in a bit. This to me brings up trends. And so Pornhub releases their stats every year. So Pornhub, again, world's most popular porn site. So these are reports in 2017, and I've got these stats are from 2017. The other trends that I'm about to show you are from 2018. So 28.5 billion annual visits to the website, 81 million daily visits, 25 billion searches performed, over 4 million videos uploaded, 68 years worth of content uploaded, and a bunch of information transferred, which, I mean, I'm not a computer geek, so I'm not too sure. But anyway, most of the guys who I know, who I've worked with and with that I've taught, tell me that petabytes are quite big, and so I will trust their opinion on that. I just thought I'd pull some of these. So some of the top searches for Canada is MILF and lesbian. Hentai is really big, which is kind of interesting. Trending searches and top trending searches in the world is anime. So lots around cartoons. Porn stars. This is interesting. In the States, it's Stormy Daniels, which we'll talk about her in a little bit here. Top 5 categories are lesbian, MILF, threesome, anal, and mature. And Asian has increased quite a bit. Threesome, lesbian, popular with white women, and amateur. Top searches in 2018, so Stormy Daniels. We'll talk about that in a bit. Fortnite, which I didn't even know what that is, but it was a video game, and that's created some pornography. 4K, romantic, trans, outdoor. Most search terms, as I said, for all countries in 2018 is lesbian and hentai and MILF. There's a lot of porn around stepmom and stepsisters, which is really interesting when we start looking at dissociation and interesting fantasies of that. Time spent per visit, right? So in Canada, we've increased to 10 minutes and 13 seconds, and I think last year it was 9 minutes and 27 seconds. So you can see different durations there. Interesting enough is Cuba has just allowed for the internet to be used. I think that's an interesting country to see how pornography may change their culture as well. These are from 2017. In 2018, over here, gaining is romantic porn, Korean porn. Amateur porn is viewed the longest. Tattooed women. Just some different categories here. These are just some other stats from 2017. You know, I've given you the PDF, so if you're interested, feel free to take a look more at those. Some interesting stats about porn. I think that, so they've analyzed some scenes of top-selling pornographic material. 88% of scenes contain physical aggression, spanking, gagging, slapping, and about 50% contain verbal aggression and name-calling. I think this is an important piece to speak about how porn is made. A lot of individuals don't know that they film the ending first. So for instance, male porn stars, They ejaculate quite quick, even if on the video it goes for hours. They often take Viagra to remain hard. And so they'll orgasm, and then they continue to have sex for X amount of time for them to record. And there's also a lot of pieces around pornography. And again, we'll probably talk about this a bit later, but just here's some really sad stats around female porn stars, and actually male porn stars, and the amount of drug abuse, STDs and STIs, inability to keep relationships, physical and verbal and psychological domestic violence, and unequal pay, right? And so the next few quotes, they might sort of get you to have a certain reaction here, but this guy who is about 19 years old, this is a quote from a long time ago, but they talk about how amateurs, like individuals who are in porn, have a sort of an expiry date unless you sort of fall into a certain niche of mature or quote-unquote old women or whatever. They often want to hire more amateurs because obviously as time goes on they become desensitized and their body becomes desensitized to pain or certain acts. And so people will find amateurs because it makes it their pain come across better on screen and they sell more. Again, they talk about, pornography actresses having high rates of substance use, alcohol or cocaine, depression. Often they're quite dissociated, drunk or high in order to work. And the work environment is incredibly toxic. Never mind the home life as well, and I sort of described this. They have about a 25% chance of making a marriage that lasts as long as 3 years, which is quite heartbreaking. I often share a story of a guy that I met by a fluke, actually, when I was in an airport bar, just having a drink before a flight. He let me know that I wasn't able to share his story online, but anyway, male porn performer. He shares a lot about his own trauma and sort of working through the shame around some of this stuff. Here's an interesting quote from a porn star. Guys are punching you in the face, you get ripped, your insides come out of you, it's never ending. You're viewed as an object, not as a human with a spirit. People do drugs because they can't deal with the way that they're being treated. I often think too in pornography, it really does not depict real sex, but a lot of individuals who are exposed to it early on actually feel that porn is real sex. And for those of you who maybe not have had real sex, I just want to put this out here that sex in real life is not like porn. And big pieces around pornography that I struggle with is often when I hear it or come across it, it just does not sound real. And so it's just an interesting experience, I think. Here's a piece that I think will probably shock a lot of you. In 2012, The Guardian discussed that 88% of self-made sexual or suggestive images posted by young people are taken from the original online location and uploaded on their other websites. So I often tell this to people, and I talk to teenagers, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit here. But if you're going to sex with someone, if you're going to put stuff online, make sure not to put your face in it. Try to just leave your body, or if you have any identifying marks that feel really, if they stick out for you, you probably want to conceal them. So a lot of websites will reuse videos and content and take it off of your Instagram, your Facebook, other platforms, Tinder, Bumble, Grindr, all of those things. And so often when I share that with students, they tend to get really, you tend to be quite shocked because there really is no privacy online with some of this stuff. Porn in the workplace. This is pretty interesting. Again, this was done in 2014, but about 63% of adult men have looked at porn at least one time while they were at work in the past 3 months. About 40% have done it more than once, and about 40% of women looked at porn at least once at work in 3 months. And so I can assure you every porn addict that I work with looks at porn in the workplace. I actually have a lawyer in my practice right now who's on probation and is going through treatment because he was looking at pornography in his workplace keeping the door open and masturbating, and getting off on people walking by while he was doing that. I think that I want to make this clear as well. I don't have any judgment about people who use porn or like porn, and not everyone who uses porn is a porn addict. I need to get that clear as well. But I'm going to show you a clip, actually, of a feminist who talks about make love, not porn. It's very direct. So for those of you who may not like coarse language, I would probably cover your ears when she tells you to. So I'll just, please pause and just watch this, and then we'll come back to the discussion. So I just really appreciate Cindy's perspective. I think it often brings a bit of humor, and I share in the space of not having any judgment, but recognizing that not everyone's sexual tastes are like what pornography says it is. And so her website is lovely. If you're interested, feel free to check it out. But here are some impacts of porn. Obviously, the ability to be aware of, control, or monitor emotional reactions or impulses or behaviors decreases with increased porn use with porn addicts. They often have an inability to repair their emotional distress, but they attempt to do that by taking control and negotiating the environment through pornography. So for women, some examples are like slut versus good mother or good girl. For men, there's a sense of being a good guy versus a player, but I think there's less shame for them. For men, premature ejaculation, and as I said, porn-induced erectile dysfunction, huge issue. For women, same thing, porn-induced erectile dysfunction and delayed orgasm, and much more research is being released around this. For men, there's a lot of research talking about the objectification. So a lot of porn addicts that I work with, when they're using porn, they tend to see only body parts. They may engage in more anonymous sex, and they may be more of a frauder, right? If you remember what that was when we talked about it. And there's an increased intrusive sex. And I can't remember if we talked about this earlier or not, but there tends to also be increased offline behavior when they hit a certain tolerance. For women, S&M, BDSM behaviors tend to increase. Porn use increases. And there's some issues around power and control, which tie into seductive role sex. Each gender and all genders on the spectrum experience shame. So for women, there's lots of studies talking about eating disorders and them trying to get the body of a porn addict. And for men, same thing, right? Body dysphoria. I have to share these stories with you. So two things come up. Actually, okay, before I get into that, let me just finish this. I'm going to get you to look at a clip so you can have a bit of a laugh, and then we can talk about it. Okay, so then we've got trauma bonds and trauma wounds as a way to sort of cope with, to use porn to cope with, and again, gender socialization, which I think we've talked about. Okay, so hit pause. I want you to watch real sex versus porn sex. It's going to make you laugh a little bit, and then we'll come back and I'll share a few stories about the body. I just love that video using food. Okay, here are some things that come up around the body and pornography. So there are a lot more surgeries where women are going to get surgeries completed so that they have smaller labias, or they want to look a certain way like a vagina in pornography. Pubic hair is making a comeback, which is kind of interesting. Not sure if we're going to go back to the 70s, which is also interesting when you look at sort of the evolution of pornography and 70s porn stars. They used to wear hair toupees, which is an interesting fact. I'll tell you two stories about men's bodies, and then we'll move on. So I read an article from a colleague who sent this to me from the States, and so women are injecting Botox into their vagina to make it tighter, quote unquote, and men are injecting Botox into their testicles, and it's called Scrotox, to eliminate the wrinkles in their testicles. So I'm sure everyone is just cringing right now because none of that sounds comfortable or enjoyable, but this is how kind of serious, and there's a whole industry of plastic surgery that's making a shit ton of money off of this, which is just wild. And again, I think ties into shame, that we're just not okay with who we are. Second story I'll tell, and I often tell this in my guest lectures, is I had a young man come in, and he was a porn addict. And he came in to see me. We had been seeing each other for about 6 weeks, and finally, and he's not the only guy who shared this story, but he shared with me that got really drunk one night. He took an X-Acto knife, and he had a mole on his penis, and he tried to remove the mole with the X-Acto knife because he felt there was something wrong with his penis because it didn't look like men's penises on the on pornography. And so it's quite heartbreaking in terms of hurting our own bodies to do this, but has some pretty serious consequences, especially if we are in shame. We're not talking about it, and people are isolated and having to make meanings, and if we're not having proper sex education. Because people are getting their sex, children and teens are getting their sex education from pornography, which we're going to talk about in a bit. Well, actually in quite a few lectures from now. So it's pretty heartbreaking when we look at the complexity of some of this stuff. Some of the other things from Cindy's talk that I thought was really interesting was looking at cream pies and facials, which is a big thing. There was a lot of research about speaking to men in their late teens to early 20s, and if they had the opportunity to ejaculate in a woman or on a woman's face, over 80% of them said that they would ejaculate on a woman's face. Higher experiences of anal sex and not done in a healthy or I'm just going to stick with healthy way or safe way. Things with pornography, obviously there's no condoms, they don't talk about menstrual cycles, there's no farting, unless that's a fetish thing. There's no discussion of disease. There's all this, fucking a woman's face. I often have a class discussion as well around porn about, what are some of the myths that we experience in life that don't match porn. And some students will talk about, women always want to have sex. Men always want to have sex. Men want to have certain types of sex. So these are the things that I think are important to discuss. And again, these are usually class discussions. So I think it may be helpful for you to also think about maybe some of your own, not even your own, whether you use pornography or not, but just knowing what are some of the myths that are shown in pornography that don't match real life. This other piece here, when we talk about shame, and I told you about the guy who self-injury and genital shame, but there's also menstrual shame, and shaming men about performance, shaming women about performance. I often tell the story about and I've heard this a lot, I had a young man come in, and he was telling me that when he attempted to have sex with his partner doggy style, that all he could think about was her being a whore and a slut, and he would actually go soft. And porn had taught him that, so that was an interesting conversation around some of that stuff. Quick introduction, we're going to talk much more about teens and porn and teens and technology and mental health next week, but Covenant Eyes is from 2014. I've got some more up-to-date stats around some of this stuff, but what's crazy? I was thinking about how I did my homework in high school and junior high, and I either had to have my music blasted or dead silent. So I could not imagine completing homework while having porn going on in the background, but 2/3 of children do so. 79% of children have unwanted exposure in their home. Mobile porn is rising, so actually one of the stats for Pornhub is actually like over 80% of people watch porn on their phones. About 40% of teens clear their history, 16% create a private email, about 50% close browser when parents come in, 52% of teens give out personal info, which is interesting, and 1 in 4 teens have handheld with internet, which I actually think is more now because of technology. I think this is interesting and important as well as we start to talk about porn. Average age of first internet exposure to pornography is 11 years of age, although some studies suggest 6 to 8 years. this is incredibly problematic, folks, because if you're watching quote-unquote vanilla porn starting at the age of 8, what kind of porn are you watching by the age of 18? Largest consumer of internet porn is the ages 12 to 17. 15 to 17-year-olds report having multiple hardcore exposures. 8 to 16-year-olds report viewing porn online, mostly while doing homework. I don't find it funny, I just get flabbergasted by that every time. 7 to 17-year-olds freely give out their home address and email addresses. And children's characters linked to thousands of porn links, including Pokemon, Action Man, Fortnite, and anything else that's included there. So, you know, markers of porn addiction, and we sort of talked about this through, you know, there's an increased use of porn use over time and the intensity. Again, they try to use it despite negative consequences. There are psychological and physiological consequences. You know, the body. We talked about this, I think, last week about how withdrawal looks a certain way. You know, Dr. Weiss talks about, for some, porn escalates to a pleasurable distraction into a behavioral compulsion, which leads to depression, isolation, loneliness, shame, and another variety of negative life consequences. Again, this is that acronym, WEAT, right? So escalating, they have withdrawal, intolerance, and as I shared with you before, individuals have the same withdrawal as cocaine addicts. Unhealthy passive coping strategies become escape, avoidance, chronic sexual fantasies, isolation, and withdrawal from others, unhealthy non-relational set of skills, which is referred to as auto-regulation, which is what Alex talks about. And then we've got unhealthy active coping skills, so the gamut from substance abuse to engaging in process addiction. The relationship is with the substance or the experience. So excessive masturbation, porn, strip clubs, you know, sexual massage parlors, cyber sex, cruising restrooms. So again, it just escalates. Again, I think, you know, it's like we talked about. I'm hoping you're noticing there's a theme in this course, right? That I don't just expose you to something once or twice. We tend to sort of integrate it repeatedly. But we talked about this in our last lecture about the different types of neural pathways. Right, so numbing seeks a calming, soothing, relaxing, or sedative experience. Fantasy is escaping to alter their perception of reality. You know, deprivation and control is the goal. And then arousal is all about pleasure and intensity. And this is also from a paper that around teens, right? So this happens for teens and adults. This being said, I have a video for you to watch, and I just heart this guy. His name is Noah Church. He talks about porn recovery. It's about 18 minutes long. I think that a lot of people can relate to it. Who do have issues with pornography. I show it a lot in my men's group. Rob Weiss actually did a wonderful interview with that guy not too long ago. Anyway, so please watch it and take notes. I think that you'll find that you'll have a bit of a laugh, and I just think that he's down to earth and really talks about some of the issues that individuals go through. So I hope that video with Noah Church was interesting to you, and maybe sort of brought this all together of what this looks like. But then this brings us to what's new. And Rob Weiss talks about, you know, radio taking 38 years to reach 50 million people. TV took 13 years to reach 50 million people, which is interesting, right? Because for those of you who are like, I don't know, probably in your 40s or 50s, if there's any of you in this class, they thought TV would like cause problems for families and make it that people didn't connect. And I actually found that TV brought families together to watch the news or sports or different programs. You know, and then also if we start talking about phones, right, when phones were brought into restaurants and such. Yeah, but I think the piece here that we need to really pay attention to is that the internet took 4 years to reach 50 million people. Social networking took 16 months to reach 50 million people. Smartphone apps took 9 months to reach 50 million people. And whatever is yet to come is now here before we even know it. So things are changing all the time, and it's reaching many, many people at a really fast pace. I talk about, I can't remember if I talked about this earlier or not, but even just sexting and technology. So, all right, yeah, I did talk about this when I spoke about some of the 10 types, right? So voyeurs or exhibitionists, right? Exhibitionists may send pictures and they may use this as a way to offend, sexually offend or offend others, and then they get off on that. This cracks me up about this picture because I don't ever remember those phones being able to take pictures, but maybe they could, I have no idea. But anyway, it's something that's an example of technology moving into an addictive pathway that was not necessarily intended. All right, so as we talk about technology and cyber sex, so this right here, this is a doll. She looks pretty real to me, and we're going to talk about sex dolls here in a bit, so I'll just save that. But in 2015, women ages 18 to 24 are watching 5% more porn than men their age. That came from Marie Claire and also a study from Pornhub. Tinder is very busy on Valentine's Day, especially for female users. Snapchat becomes the most efficient way for prostitution, and that was in 2015, and that's actually still an ongoing trend. Masturbation is often a way in which sex addicts may present these issues. We've got teledildonics and cyberdonics, which is different clips that I often show in my guest lectures, but we won't jump into that. Sex trafficking. I think I'm going to save this for sex offending just because it seems like for many of you there's a lot of content, so we'll just put that in sex offending. And then I want you to just take a look at the notes that I typed out in terms of the levels of cyber sex addicts. I think that's pretty straightforward. Again, it follows that continuum and just basically shows when there may be a problem with certain with people who use cyber sex or not. I think I also put a question that you could respond to in your personal reflection around can cyber sex be a problem, or can it be positive in a relationship, which I think is an interesting discussion. Years ago when I first taught this, I did not believe this quote from Kimberly Young, but the more that I've worked in the field, I think it's true. So sexual acting out online has been shown to manifest in similar offline behavior. People who are already sex addicts find the internet accelerates their problem. Those who start in the online behavior quickly start to act out in new ways offline. Every client of mine that has a porn addiction has this. I think about a particular individual who had OCD, religious background that contributed to a lot of his compulsivity, which he discovered, and was looking at pornography 8 hours a day, which then transferred to him searching for deep throat blowjobs, and would receive like 8 or 9 of those a day. Remains a virgin because that's important for his faith-based background, but would often talk about his fear of if sex with his girlfriend, because he had a girlfriend the whole time, with sex with his girlfriend would be vanilla, which is really interesting because I think that what he describes in the compulsion around this to me sounds really vanilla and rigid. And so actually he's moved down to the States now and is seeing a colleague down there, and I think doing okay. But he did leave my practice for a certain short period of time, lost his job because he was sleeping with clients, started to stalk clients that he slept with. Anyway, so very interesting case study for sure. Technology, right? So I often, and these, listen folks, I don't think that these are all bad because I've lectured about this and I had a couple students being like, my partner and I have a fleshlight and we really enjoy it and this is what gives us fulfillment in our sex lives. That's great. If that's what helps you guys feel connected as partners or even by yourself, that's cool. I just still have to sort of present this as we have this discussion about as technology starts to increase, how this may impact people with addictive pathways around sex. I'd like you to pause this. I have an interesting clip around Louis C.K. and technology, a bit of humor, and also kind of weird because he is, we'll be talking about him in sex offending, but I think it is the best clip to sort of talk about technology and what possibly technology may be taking away, right? For some people, this is just one perspective. Okay, so I hope that provided a bit of light and just a different perspective in terms of technology. Now, I thought this was kind of a hilarious ad. So Ashley Madison, I've often shared this story with folks. I worked with a guy who actually trained me down in the States, the guy that I got the quote from at the beginning of this lecture, or of this course. And he ran a treatment center down in the States, and he was actually signed up for Ashley Madison. And he, when in 2015, when that, if you guys can remember, there was a threat of a hack. And what had happened is that they threatened to expose, a couple million people on their, from their website to disclose their personal information, who they'd, hooked up with, their conversations. And he ended up killing himself because he had 3 kids and didn't want to disappoint his wife. And she found out about this, him relapsing once he died, which is really, it was pretty heartbreaking. But some of this stuff has some really serious consequences, especially to families and addicts. Often when I think of Ashley Madison and the online advertisements, and feel free to pause it, I put 2 examples of the commercials on Moodle. But in the halftime show in one of the football Super Bowls, there was a 60-second commercial, and what it said is, "Don't be a victim of your marriage, cheat." Listen, advertisers pay good money to put that in there in order to sort of increase their profit, and so you can just imagine how that may have impacted certain people's subconscious around that. I also find these commercials to be the guy with the white guy who's sitting there singing about his wife. I mean, if that does not enact hegemonic masculinity, I'm not sure what does, but it's very interesting. So, in 2018, this was the first piece around talking about sex robots. These body parts creep me right out. I've seen too many horror movies. If you take a look at the different options here, the other thing is that when it comes to sex robots, there's an increase in male sex robots as well. I just bring different pictures in here. So we got male sex robots, heterosexual here, some of the faces, how they may be intimate, and then also, maybe technology is not always bad, right? These seniors with a little robot. I just wanted to put that out there. So please pause. I want you to see there is a news clip titled "Sex Robots." I'd like you to watch that. That was just released, I don't know, I think that was like 2 or 3 months ago. I showed it in a lecture that I was teaching in psychology a few months ago. Kind of interesting. It talks about Stormy Daniels, talks about cloning her vagina and her body, which is really interesting. So feel free to pause and take a look at that. And with that, I guess, you know what, I'll leave that discussion for cheating. We'll talk about that later. What I'd like you to do then, we've got 2 more slides left. This is the clip that I show on technology and sexuality. And you've got a personal reflection and then also a discussion question on this, but just really curious how you may think that this stuff impacts human psychology and sexuality and relationships in a positive and or negative way. Heads up, this stuff has sexual content. There's stuff around masturbation in it. I'm trying to remember, I haven't seen it in about a year. Just talks a little bit about Silicon Valley. There's, some nudity in there. So just a heads up about that stuff. And last but not least, this sort of brings us to our arousal template. And an arousal template is a total constellation of thoughts, images, behaviors, sounds, smells, sights, fantasies, and objects that arouse us sexually. You know, it encompasses categories of stimuli from early experiences, family, friends, religious affiliations, media, teachers. You know, we do have preferences, folks, okay? I do not want to deny that, and I think we will have you explore your own arousal template in the coming weeks. But what I want to make known to you is this. I have yet to work with an individual with a pornography addiction or issues in cybersex that by the time they're sober and we work through it, that they have the same preferences that they did when they watched pornography. I use this example of a lot of young men that I've worked with that once we work through their stuff and they're sober, they start to discover that they're not aroused by what industry or advertising tells them that they're aroused by. And that, I think, is really inspiring, and I really enjoy doing that type of work. Because I think if you remember the first lecture, a lot of what has inspired me to do this work, and even my own work, is finding out what is healthy sexuality. And I don't think porn addiction is healthy sexuality. And I'm not saying everyone who uses porn is a problem. But as you'll hear Rob Weiss talk about, there are evolutionary arguments to this stuff, in the sense that it could be that individuals maybe who are addicted to pornography, maybe evolutionarily it's a positive thing, because that gets them to go out of the gene pool. People get really offended when I say that. It's not me saying that. I'm just sharing some of the research, but there's a lot of different perspectives here. So I hope you find that video to be interesting and sort of helpful in terms of understanding some of this stuff. So anyway, thanks again, and we'll talk to you next week.